For the first time since the passage of Roe v. Wade, women living in Missouri could lose access to the only remaining Planned Parenthood clinic in the state. The women's health provider sounded the alarm this week, saying that officials are threatening to close that facility, and it is the only one that provides abortions in the entire state of Missouri. This news comes on the heels of the Supreme Court's decision on a controversial law in Indiana.
In Box v. Planned Parenthood, the court weighed in on two provisions of a law regulating abortions. The justices upheld the requirement for fetal remains to be buried or cremated, reversing a decision by the Seventh Circuit. But they did not overturn the circuit court's decision to strike down a ban on abortions on the basis of race, sex, or disability. Here to break down the court's decision and the opinions from Justices Thomas and Ginsburg is Toni Van Pelt. She's the president of NOW, the National Organization for Women, and chairwoman of the Political Action Committee. Thank you very much for joining us, Toni. What's your overall reaction to these cases the Supreme Court weighed in on?
Well, my first reaction is one of I'm very sad by this, and of course upset. And many women in the country are very angry by the fact that these men have made this decision about their bodily integrity, when it's really none of their business.
Well, it wasn't just men who weighed in on this. It was a 7-2 decision, and a couple of liberals actually went along with it. So why are you saying just men?
Because it is driven by men. I'm uncertain as to what you're talking about, but Clarence Thomas talked about eugenics in this decision. They talked about the fact that they didn't bring up that this would be an undue burden on women, when in fact it is an undue burden on women.
Well, Kagan joined the majority. I mean, when you say men, I mean, my understanding is that Kagan joined the majority here. She's obviously a woman.
Thanks for bringing up that point.
Right, yeah. Well,
what do you make of, to your point on the undue burden, there was some criticism of the lawyering here, that basically they didn't make an argument based on undue burden. They looked at something different, and that was what the ruling was based on. Is that something that you agree with?
I think that was really parsed out when the justices brought that up and said that they didn't make that argument.
Yeah.
And it is an important argument to make, because all of these decisions are an undue burden on women when you limit their right to safe, accessible abortion care. And by attacking doctors, you're attacking women's right to their medical care.
Well, what does the disposal of fetal remains have to do with an undue burden? Can you explain that point to me?
Well, when you put women in that position, then they have a psychological and a financial burden that they would not normally have. You know, medical waste is normally handled as medical waste. That's what we're talking about here. This is fetal tissue.
It costs hundreds of dollars more, essentially, if this law is in place for a woman to obtain an abortion. Zooming out from this particular ruling, what can we read into this decision about where the court might be heading on abortion? Obviously, we've had some incredibly aggressive laws passed, most notably in Alabama, where abortion was essentially banned outright, and they basically dared the court to take it up. They are hoping that that law goes to the Supreme Court and ultimately ends up in overturning Roe versus Wade. What can we read in the tea leaves thus far?
Well, I think that we know what we can read in the tea leaves. When we had Kavanaugh seated on the court, that they had, the conservative Catholic men have a majority now on that court. And we know that they are opposed to a woman's right to self-integrity and to make their own decisions as to whether or not they want to carry a pregnancy to term.
What do you make of the argument that, you know, that law may have gone too far, and Justice Roberts is more of an incrementalist and is more likely to side with sort of, you know, these creeping restrictions on abortion rather than an outright overturn of Roe versus Wade?
Well, I think that that's where they're headed, and they feel like that would protect them and protect the court from being accused of being too political, being too patriarchal in the decisions that they make.
Why should the gender of the justice matter in these cases?
Why should the gender of the justice?
Yeah.
In this particular case, we're talking about particular men that hold these views, and that's why it would matter.
What about the fact that in Roe v. Wade, all of the majority were men? Does that then affect their ability to weigh in an impartial and fair manner in your mind?
They're not here, and we're not talking about that now. We're talking about today.
I'm just trying to establish a principle as to why it is that the gender of the justice should matter.
I really don't see that as important to this discussion, because what we're talking about is women here. We're not talking about men, except in the way that men try to control women, and that's why
Madam,
it would
respectfully,
matter.
the first thing you said when you sat down is this is a decision by a bunch of men. So
That's
I think
right.
okay.
And I just said that it is men who are trying to control women. That's why it's so important that we put more women onto the state legislatures, so that we can stop these egregious laws that are unconstitutional from coming forward. When we have more women in office, more women making these decisions, we won't see these kinds of horrific laws.
What is NOW's position on sex-selective abortion?
We don't have a position on that. Our position is that women are the decision makers when it comes to their own body, and it's nobody else's business.
Tell us, if Roe versus Wade were to be overturned, and basically then every state can do whatever they want in terms of banning abortion, restricting abortion, et cetera, what would that look like? What would that world look like? You know, we just talked about how in Missouri there's one remaining clinic. It is in danger of being shut down. There are a number of states that are already in that situation where abortion is almost de facto illegal. What would the landscape across the country look like if Roe was overturned? What
it will look like is we will go back to those days of pre-Roe, where women that are wealthy, that have money, will travel to the areas in the states where they can get abortions, or they will have a private doctor that will perform it for them. This will really rest heavily on the backs of women that live in poverty and women of color that don't have access to the wealth that they will need for safe, affordable, effective health care for them in the way that when they need abortion.
Should abortions be directly subsidized by taxpayers?
I think that all health care should not be subsidized, but is a universal right for people. That's my personal position.
So tax dollars should go toward abortions, which you believe is part of health care?
All health care. Birth control, sex education, abortion.
Tony, thank you so much. Great to have you today.
Thank you for having me.
Coming up on Rising, according to a recent Quinnipiac poll, 87% of Democrats support stricter gun control laws.
And 2020 candidates are taking note. We discussed their gun control plans with the Executive Director of Guns Down America, Igor Volsky, when Rising continues.